In Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version.
The evidence points to the fact, even in the earliest gospel, interwoven through all the gospels, verified by the strongest criterion of historical investigation, Jesus claimed to be God.
Alex O'Connor has lots of discussions and debates with Christians. And while he seems quite comfortable criticizing Christianity, he doesn't seem nearly as interested in criticizing Islam. Why is that?
Rising star Wes Huff was just on Joe Rogan to talk about the Bible, and so, of course, I had to make a response. We begin with a claim about the book of Isaiah. For a long time, our earliest copy of the Book of Isaiah dated to the Middle Ages, so it was difficult to know if it had been accurately preserved or changed over the thousands of years since it was written. But then we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, a set of ancient manuscripts found in Qumran dating to around 2,000 years ago. And amazingly, within them, we found a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, 1,000 years older than the oldest one that we had until then. Take a listen.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word?
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true.
Wes Huff responded to Alex's claim that he got the Bible wrong on Joe Rogan's podcast, and we will look into Wes's comment shortly. To help us reach more people, please like this video, subscribe, and enable the bell icon.
In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there, which tells us that they were a later addition. Here are some words from the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls project by the Israel Museum, which houses the Isaiah scroll. The text of the Great Isaiah scroll generally confirms the Masoretic or traditional version codified in medieval codices, all 66 chapters of the Hebrew version in the same conventional order. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. Well over 2,600. Again, many of these variants are minor, but Wes Huff told Joe Rogan that the scroll is word for word identical with the Masoretic text.
It was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Which is simply not true.
Alex must be feeling good about his ignorance or clever move to deceive people. Sadly, Alex deceptively asserts that Wes Huff lied, attempting to discredit him. Moreover, he made it sound as though some parts of the book of Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 2:9 through 10, were a later addition. The claim that Isaiah 2:9 through 10 contains missing text is unfounded, as evidenced by the consistency of this passage in ancient manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Great Isaiah Scroll, dated around 150 to 100 BC, preserve these verses without omissions. The Masoretic text, the authoritative Hebrew text of the Jewish Bible, and the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures 3rd to 2nd century BC, also include these verses intact, affirming their authenticity across textual traditions. If Alex were interested in facts and not attempting to look for loopholes to denigrate the Word of God and lie against Wes, he would have made it clear that the verses he claimed were missing may not have been in one specific scroll, but nonetheless, they were still part of the scroll. This person commented on Alex's video, "A rare yet definitive miss from Alex. Don't fall into the clickbait for relevance trap at the expense of quality, sir." Here is another comment. Billy Carson level research done by Alex. Another person commented, so I checked into the Isaiah 2:9-10 missing text. Oddly enough, those missing words appear in a few of the other DSS of chapter 2 in the DSS. Seems like Huff is essentially correct. To which this person replied, he's essentially right, and technically wrong. Not about finding the exact language in much older documents, but about the fact it's not in one specific scroll that is among those documents. To give the impression that text is missing entirely, without mentioning it is still found in multiple scrolls of the DSS, that is lying by omission or ignorance. Yes, Wes could have been more precise, but it is clearly evident that Alex was being dishonest. This person commented, it speaks volumes about what a great channel Alex has built, that his fan base critiques him for his weaker arguments, instead of just being an echo chamber for everything he says. I wonder why Alex decided to make this response, though, as it seems so different from his current style of content. Another person commented, it's a bit of a shame that you leave out the part where Wes explains what he means with having an agenda. Honestly, this feels like a cheap shot. Wes responded to Alex on Instagram stating, hey, at Cosmic Skeptic, I'm actually in the process of making a video clarifying a few times I misspoke during the 3-hour conversation. I'm far from infallible. This will be part of that discussion. Nonetheless, my point in this was less about misspeaking or being dishonest and more about needing to be a little more careful in the argument. But I take your point and am going to address it publicly myself. This comment from Benjamin Joseph Hunt further explains Alex's 2,600 text variants, which on closer examination are extremely insignificant. Hey Alex, I get where you're coming from, but after digging into this myself, I think Wes is actually right when he says the Qumran Isaiah scroll and the Masoretic text are word for word identical, even with those 2,600 variants you mentioned. Here's why. Over 95% of the text is identical, and most of those 2,600 variants are just defective versus plain spellings, basically fuller versus shorter forms of words. These spelling differences don't affect meaning, and most scholars wouldn't even count them as real differences. When you take those out, you're left with about 500 to 600 minor variants. Of those 500 to 600, most are just word order swaps or small grammatical changes that don't change the message of the text. For example, in some places, Lord God is swapped with God the Lord, a meaningless difference. Once you remove these, only about 15 to 20 variants could even be worth noting. Out of those 15 to 20, only 4 minor differences remain that anyone might care about. One of those is Isaiah 53:11, where the Qumran scroll includes the phrase, "and he will bear their iniquities," omitted in the Masoretic text. Far from being a problem, this actually confirms Christianity, since it shows the earlier text explicitly pointed to a suffering servant bearing sins, exactly what Christians believe about Jesus. If anything, it strengthens confidence in the accuracy of the biblical text. Wes's point holds up even better because of this. Another example of one of the only 4 remaining minor variants is Isaiah 33:8, where the Qumran scroll says they broke the laws, while the Masoretic text says they broke the covenant. Both express the same idea, Israel's rebellion against God. Alex, is that really enough to argue the texts aren't basically identical? Out of such a large book, only 4 minor differences remain, none of which change the message. Honestly, when you say, that would be amazing if it were true, I think you're missing how extraordinary this really is. Scholars frequently describe ancient texts as word-for-word identical when the differences are insignificant or don't change the meaning, even if there are minor variations in spelling, word order, or grammar. Your argument seems overly rigid here, Alex, because in textual studies, word-for-word identical doesn't mean literal perfection. It means the text has been faithfully transmitted with no significant loss of meaning. The Qumran Isaiah scroll and the Masoretic text fit this description perfectly. After a 1,000-year gap, a book as big as Isaiah, 66 chapters and over 1,200 verses, has only 4 minor differences. That's almost miraculous compared to other ancient texts. The fact that over 99.69% of the text is unchanged shows how incredibly well preserved the Hebrew Scriptures were, whether through careful scribal work or something greater. At the end of the day, Alex saying the Qumran and Masoretic texts are word-for-word identical is completely fair. Minor variants like laws versus covenant don't change the fact that the core message has been preserved with extraordinary accuracy. Thanks, Benjamin, for the additional context. We are not surprised that Alex would go this far because he's an atheist, but as David Wood rightly pointed out, Alex is not bold enough to criticize Islam the way he does Christianity.
Alex O'Connor, the agnostic formerly known as Cosmic Skeptic, has lots of discussions and debates with Christians. And while he seems quite comfortable criticizing Christianity, he doesn't seem nearly as interested in criticizing Islam. Why is that?
Okay, we're going to move fast. Base Autist, thanks very much, says, Alex, I'm a longtime fan. I became a Christian, but I still love your work and your honesty. I'm curious, though, why it seems you've left Islam alone. Is this for personal reasons or safety? Much love and God bless.
Yeah, well, of course, it is a much less safe thing to do. That's one of the benefits of Christianity, by the way. But I do think that I simply know less about it. Of course, I don't believe Islam is true, and I believe it has all kinds of problems and moral objections that I'm sure that if I made my moral objections to Islam plain, Cliff and Stuart would not want to object to my meta-ethics, but instead just be happy that I was doing it. But I just know less about it. I feel like I'm pretty well versed in at least the New Testament at this point, and it's mostly a consequence of that. But of course, you do have to be much more careful as well, because I've never had to fear for my safety when debating a Christian like today.
Pretty straightforward. He knows more about Christianity. He sounds like he knows more about Christianity because he's more interested in discussing Christianity, and since it's safer to talk about Christianity, why would he want to focus much on Islam?
I know already that is the case because I was in touch with him personally when he made a video about Islam. I don't remember what the video was about, but he made a video about Islam, about Islam's treatment of others and so on. And he took the video down after receiving threats and things like that.
At the end of the day, the Bible had already warned us in 2 Peter 3:3 that there shall be mockers in the last days. Also, Alex said that Wes's statement about Jesus claiming to be God is not true.
Okay, moving on to the New Testament.
Was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead, we're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years, because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
There was quite a lot there. First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including? Come on.
Well, many scholars believe that the earliest gospel is the Gospel of Mark, and listen to how the late Nabil Qureshi proved Jesus' divinity in the Gospel of Mark.
There's only one place in the entire Gospel of Mark that Jesus comes out and boldly proclaims who he is. Now, up until then, he's been using a title for himself quite regularly. What is that title? Son of Man. Over 80 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the term Son of Man. The first time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. The next time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Throughout Mark's Gospel, Son of Man is the one where Jesus uses the title to refer to himself frequently. But then there's a Son of Man in the book of Daniel, which looks very, very different. This is a Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven. What does that mean? The only being that comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament is a divine being. In fact, God comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament. So here in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, you have one who looks like a Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, like I said, there's one place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus boldly, loudly, publicly, clearly proclaims who he is. And that's Mark chapter 14, verse 62. In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus has been asked by the high priest, who is he? Who is he? Up until this point, he hasn't been saying. This is known as the climax of Mark's gospel. This is what everything has been building to. This question, Jesus, who are you? And Jesus responds, the question is, who are you? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So which Son of Man is Jesus referring to? I can hear you. Daniel. He's referring to the one in Daniel, the Son of Man who comes to the clouds of heaven. That's the one he's been talking about. Let's revisit Daniel and see what the Son of Man is about. Daniel is looking at his vision. He's having a vision, and he sees God, the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped on a throne. And then Daniel says something very interesting. He says, behold, verse 13, chapter 7, behold, I look in my night visions, and one like a Son of Man approached the Ancient of Days. So here's God the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped by angels. One like a Son of Man came on the clouds of heaven. As only God and divine being comes, the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven. And to him, that Son of Man, is given glory, authority, and sovereign power. He's coming as a God into heaven. He's given glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven. Then it says, people of every nation and language served him. Stop. Who is the one who receives service in heaven? God. And then it says his kingdom is one that will not pass away and his dominion will never be destroyed. Yet Jesus claims not only to be the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, whose worship with a service due only to God, but also has the right to sit next to God on the throne. He's the heir to the throne of God. Is it any surprise then why the high priests in this Inquisition opened up their robes and said, you have heard the blasphemy for himself. What shall we do? And everyone responds, crucify him. What was blasphemy at that time? Again, I'm going to defer to Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman says that it's not blasphemy to claim to be a Messiah. It's not blasphemy to tell people they're wrong. It's blasphemy to claim prerogatives due only to God. And that's what Jesus claimed. That's why he was found guilty for blasphemy. That's why he was crucified. The evidence points to the fact, even in the earliest gospel, interwoven through all the gospels, verified by the strongest criterion of historical investigation, Jesus claimed to be God.
Lastly, Alex attempted to cast doubt on Jesus' resurrection, claiming that Paul's statement about Jesus showing up to over 500 people, which Wes mistakenly said was 400, must be a fabrication since there was no mention of this story anywhere else in the Bible.
After mentioning the Gospels, Wes goes on to talk about Paul. Whenever the Gospels were written, and by whomever, we know that Paul is the earliest source of the New Testament, dating squarely from the middle of the 1st century. And we think that he actually did write at least 7 of the letters attributed to him. And so it's to him that we now turn.
How do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1
Okay.
Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything about this extraordinary event.
To Alex O'Connor, the resurrection of Jesus may mean nothing, but it means a lot to millions of people who have recognized that their salvation and eternity hinge on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Also, Alex seems to miss this in Paul's letter, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. So, the vast majority of the people who witnessed Jesus' resurrection were still alive at the time Paul wrote this letter to the church at Corinth. So, Paul was not making up a story that could not have been verified. In Luke 24:34, Jesus appeared to Simon. In John 20:19-20, Jesus appeared to the disciples. The Bible didn't say how many, but in Acts 1:15, 120 disciples gathered in the upper room when the Holy Spirit came upon them. In Acts 2:32, Peter declares, "This Jesus God raised up, and we are all witnesses of it." In Acts 3:15, Peter testifies, "You killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead." To this we are witnesses. In Acts 10:40-41, Peter explains, God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who had been chosen by God as witnesses. We can conclusively say that Jesus appeared to multiple people after his resurrection. Whether other apostles or New Testament writers specifically mention the number of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus or not is irrelevant, but the most important thing is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. As for Alex, it's not too late for him to repent, put his trust in Jesus Christ, and stop misleading people. Just know that one day you will stand before the holy and righteous judge and give an account.